Well, welcome everyone. My name is Bidyut Bose. I'm the founder and executive director of Niroga Institute. So we're going to be tackling a pretty complex subject, countering white supremacy and systemic racism with mindfulness education. So as we start with our presentation and in a mindfulness conference, why don't we all take a mindful moment? Let's come up sitting comfortably. Perhaps ears, shoulders, and hips aligned, eyes and mouth softened. If you're comfortable, feel free to close your eyes or find a point in front of you that holds your attention. Chest and abdomen relaxed, breathing naturally, not trying to change your breathing in any way whatsoever. Feeling each breath, perhaps each bit of each breath, just as it's happening. As you continue with your natural breathing, let's add a layer to it, a bit of rhythm, breathing in to a count of 3 or 4, breathing out twice as slowly to 6 or 8, perhaps like this. In, 2, 3, out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Your own count, your own pace, feeling each breath, and perhaps watching it a little more closely. Are you breathing fast or slow? Is it shallow or deep? How's the flow? Choppy and jagged or really smooth? Feeling and watching each breath, breath by breath and moment by moment. And as you continue with this bit of rhythmic breathing, let's add yet another layer to it. Resting a hand on your belly, your abdomen if you're comfortable, otherwise just visualizing it. And as you breathe into a count of 3 or 4, actively and gently pushing your abdomen forward and out in a big, giant balloon belly breath. And as you're breathing out twice as slowly to 6 or 8, gently and actively pulling your abdomen in towards your spine, taking your belly hand in with you. Deep and rhythmic belly breathing at your own pace, feeling each breath, watching each breath, watching each thought, each movement of your mind, breath by breath, moment by moment. And as you continue with this bit of rhythmic belly breathing, one more layer of mindfulness, one strike of this chime, listening with our fullest possible attention for the very last trace of sound. Thank you all. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you feel you're a little bit more calm, relaxed, focused, perhaps? Okay, thanks. So this is going to be quite interactive. Okay, it's not about BK, making a one-way download by any means. There's a lot of collective intelligence in the group, and we're going to tap into it. 2 ways to share out at any time throughout the presentation. One is use the chat window liberally. So Sheila and I will be watching the chat window, making sure we can capture your comments, your questions, and so on. And the other is just unmute yourself, raise a hand, and pipe out. That way we can get to your thoughts and comments and questions as we go. I have a short PowerPoint deck, and I'll take a moment to share screen, and then we'll plunge right in. Okay, can everyone see the title slide? All right, so let me also make sure I have the chat window up and out. So what we just did was a little mindful moment. This sweet picture is Shaka, one of our program managers, with a couple of student peer leaders in a middle school in a very challenging part of Oakland, leading a whole group of school leaders and district leaders in practice. So the research around the roots of white supremacy point to a few things. For example, there's this pervasive belief that Western societies should belong to white people. That then, of course, leads to an othering, leads to a sense of superiority, the domination, and all of that. A decline of some of our unifying institutions. There are many that we used to look at to help us see the essential commonality of our existences, and that is starting to erode. A couple of things more specifically with what's happening in the US, but with ramifications worldwide. Anti-immigrant rhetoric, as millions of people are getting displaced, trying to find other homes, perhaps a little safer, a little kinder, gentler world. And then in the US, Obama's 8 years has also created a pretty significant backlash. So as you look at this list, and there are many others, factors that are considered root causes of white supremacy, what are some thoughts? What is missing? Any of you feel like you have a sense of a foundational cause of white supremacy? What does it look like to you? Just taking a few moments, a quick phrase, a word, quick thought. Okay, of non-white identifying people, hundreds of years of colonization, and then institutions supporting enslavement of Black people, absolutely. Decline of empathy, okay, cultural conditioning, capital insurrection, assimilation, cultural appropriation, systemic injustice. All right, wonderful, wonderful. So a lot of things coming up. Complex intersecting systems, of course. Let's look at the next question. Systemic racism. There are, of course, connections between white supremacy and systemic racism. And so, again, some of the research that points us to are things that you have already listed, historical and underlying structural issues. So structures like our social, political, financial structures that, of course, then create challenges with areas, domains that we're familiar with, whether it's education, whether it's jobs, whether it's housing, whether it's homelessness, whether it's healthcare. So the criminalization of poverty, this has been happening very systematically for quite a few decades in this country, going all the way back to the 13th Amendment and before, kind of vestiges of what has been going on since slavery. Media has a role in this, whether it's conservative media, where all of a sudden truth and falsehood are all mixed up, whether it's social media, where all of a sudden, someone gets a megaphone and is blasted out repeatedly, lie after lie after lie, and so on and so forth. And then the pervasive impacts of artificial intelligence, where we're getting to a point where people are feeding us information that they think we're interested in. So imagine the mind bend here, where all of a sudden you have no idea what's truth and falsehood. You're not even able to sift out what is being spoon-fed, what is the selective information that you're getting. And that's very, very insidious, where you're hardly even aware of it. Some have pointed to a lack of gun reform, the militarization of our police, who are supposed to be protecting and serving the communities, turning upside down. So all of that is happening. campaign finance, the contributions, all of those have been pointed at around systemic racism. And so what's missing? Anything more to the list that already started to pour out from y'all? Yes, so much more, absolutely. I was just trying to keep the font size reasonable in my slide. So just giving you 3, 4, 5 things that pop up. Yes. Yes. What else? Religion. Yes, absolutely. Where you look at the mystics of the world in every major tradition and you see such essential commonality. And yet when it comes to implementation, what tremendous chaos, right? No wonder people have tried to scrub mindfulness secular for a bit. Yes, isolation, the human mind. Okay, roots of police departments, capture, escape, and stay. Absolutely. Yes, the school to prison pipeline, the privatization of prisons. All right, lots of beautiful things coming up. And so I noted a couple of things in the chat window as things were getting quickly poured out. One came up, this lack of empathy. Another that came up was self-awareness. You notice a foundational difference between most of the things that came up, about 90%, and 2 or 3 things that came up which reflect something in our internal environment. So things in our external environment, systems and structures, and then things that are in our internal environment. It's not one or the other. It's like we need some balance of our efforts on both, perhaps. And so keeping that in mind, this question of system versus individual, let's just see how that plays out. Here's a quote from critical theory. If you don't know what that is, it's basically around sociology, social philosophy, political philosophy, basically looking at critiquing society, looking for challenging inequity and power structures. And so the Frankfurt School is given a lot of credit for developing critical theory. So people like Adorno and Horkheimer and Fromm and so on and so forth, all the way to the second generation, like Habermas and so on. And what have they said? Let's take a look. Social problems are influenced and created more by societal structures and cultural assumptions than by individual and psychological factors. Mulling that over, a question for all of you. Do you agree? Why? Do you disagree? Why? Okay, Scott says, I agree. Give us some justification. Okay, enlightened policy, okay. What else? Agree and, all right, I love it. Individuals perpetuate institutions, yes, so inner work helps the outer work. Okay, very good. Yes, assumptions. Hard to navigate the world individually, okay? And we hear that often, right? Individual change is slow and so on and so forth. And we need to change systems. So let's hold that thought and take another mindful moment, okay? As you're mulling this over, systems or individuals or something in between. So this time, adding a little bit of movement, breathing in, shoulders up and back, breathing out, shoulders down and forward. Very slow and deliberate. Breathing in, shoulders up and back. You can, of course, do this standing or sitting, however you like. Breathing down and forward. Now, a couple more circles at your own pace. It's not about speed at all. It's about range of motion. Nudging your shoulders to the very edges of their range of motion in each successive direction. Up, back. As you're breathing in, you're just expanding and then out and down and forward. Beautiful. Let's go the other way. Breathing in, back and up. Breathing out, forward and down. These huge circles at your shoulders. like your own personal shoulder massage, just indulging for a moment. And then gradually coming back to neutral and reverting right away to focus on the sound of the chime, our friend, gently pulling our minds into the present, listening for the very last trace of this fading, evanescent sound with your fullest possible attention. Thank you all. So continuing this conversation, systems, or individuals. So some more insights. Jim Collins, who's a renowned organizational development expert, reminds us that who we are determines what we do. And that develops the trajectory of our lives, of our organizations, of our communities. And Gandhi reminds us, be the change. We all know that the operative word here isn't change. It's that little two-letter word, be. If we can't embody the change, what change are we going to get? It's not about system change doesn't matter. Of course it does. Concrete economic, legislative policy changes historically have shown to have some impact. For example, Holocaust education is now compulsory in all secondary schools in Germany. So we can't just erase a part of history because we are uncomfortable. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, with so many people involved, Desmond Tutu and Mandela and so many others, basically, yes, many issues with TRC, but also it was an attempt to correct some wrongs foundationally. We are working with the Inuit First Nation people in deep northeastern Canada in tiny little villages. And there's a huge effort right now to rewrite all of the curricula for the education of First Nation people in Canada. These are examples of some significant shifts working at the systemic level. And yet, if you look at the work of Ibram Kendi and others, his recent book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is gaining a lot of traction. Just see what he says. The basic struggle that we're all in is a struggle to be fully human, to see others as fully human. To be anti-racist requires self-awareness, requires self-reflection. Some of you have brought that up. And a radical reorientation of our consciousness. Just mull that over for a moment. A radical reorientation of our consciousness. We know that yes, systems are important, but I ask you, who designs systems? Do they fall from the sky? Individuals get into groups perhaps and design systems. Selfish individuals are going to design inequitable systems. Incompetent individuals are going to design inefficient systems. This is not rocket science. This is the nature of the beast. And so perhaps one thing to keep in mind is that personal transformation needs to be the very foundation for system change. Otherwise, we are on very shaky ground. The systems that we design could be convincing enough to a few and yet produce tremendous harm. The risk is less if there is personal transformation with some of the qualities that have already been mentioned. So let's think about a few key connections that I want to lay out for you in sequence to see if it makes sense. Yes, Gloria, the trauma piece, and we're going to be getting to that soon. So Robert Reich, a renowned labor economist, a professor at UC Berkeley, he talks about the fact that inequity breeds social distrust. When you have one group thinking they're superior to another, when you have systems that perpetuate racism, often there is a huge amount of inequity in power and privilege. And all Dr. Reich, Professor Reich is saying is that the more the inequity, the greater the social distrust. What are the implications of that? Distrust leads to fear. For oppressor and oppressed. Remember the bully in the schoolyard? Often one of the most scared kids, right? Thinking somehow that offense is the best defense. Look at brain dissections of people like Stalin and Mussolini and others, and you find the amygdala, the fear centers, significantly enlarged. So we know that pattern in dictators. What happens with fear? A foundational core emotion, really powerful, and it evokes the stress response. Fight, flight, or freeze. You're either going to try to duke it out, or you're going to run for your life, or you're going to freeze, to shut down. Disruptive behaviors, distracted behaviors, disengaged behaviors start to play out as our nervous systems shift from the centered and grounded, the parasympathetic, to the sympathetic. Neuroscience has shown that stress reduces empathy, a word that came up earlier when I asked what is missing. Without empathy, or with reduced empathy, we're more likely to hurt and to harm rather than to help and to heal. And now the question becomes, how do we develop empathy? If we just sit and cry, empathy, 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 just like any powerful positive emotion, gratitude, forgiveness, love, compassion, these are skills. These are foundational, transformative life skills that can be developed. And neuroscience is pointing at an approach showing that mindfulness practices can systematically develop empathy. And so we can confidently say that empathy can be manufactured on the anvil of mindfulness practice. I'm tired of hearing that mindfulness is about coming and relaxing. It's so much more. And we need to have some clarity around that. But now we need to get to a key question. Is your mindfulness trauma-informed? It's important because trauma is endemic in this conversation of white supremacy, systemic racism, domination, and subjugation, colonization, all of that. I often hear so many newfangled trauma-hyphenated words these days is because it seems very hot. Trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, trauma-conscious, trauma-responsive, trauma-infused, and it just goes on and on and on. And yet, there needs to be a simple way for each one of us to answer the question, is my mindfulness trauma-informed? Because we need that in our schools. We need that in our children, in our teachers, in our counselors, in our parents. Why? Because systemic racism creates trauma. Yes, Megan, we'll be getting to some of these. The idea that if you talk about empathy, it's, what is it that comes up in oppressed people when we talk about empathy? Let us talk about that. You want to give us, unmute yourself, speak up.
Thank you, Dr. Bose. It's something I've been thinking about lately. I teach 14-year-old students,
yes.
Who are mostly students of color. in poverty. And I was when we started to go through the period of racial reckoning, I suddenly realized that the way I was teaching empathy was really the wrong emphasis. And all of a sudden I was caught on the spot and just couldn't speak because I realized it was just not the right position. I don't feel I'm being particularly articulate at this moment. I guess empathy is wonderful and beautiful, but sometimes empowerment is more important. Um,
Yes.
um, so just that empathy shouldn't be forced on people who first need to heal themselves
Yes.
and
Yes.
need the
So,
tools to heal themselves.
yes. And of course, where is the source of our true power? That also is something that we need to look at, right? I remember a 17-year-old kid in an alternative high school in Oakland talking about, this practice, mindfulness practice, trauma-informed mindfulness, got him to a place where not all of his problems in his community and family and all just melted away, but it actually gave him the tools to not get as affected as he used to get. And that, he said, was so incredibly powerful with his hands and fists and so on. So that little anecdote brings up in my mind that, yes, these practices that mindfulness develops, whether it's stress resilience, whether it's self-regulation, whether it's self-awareness, whether it's shifting a little bit in our relationships, those are some significant skills that allow us to tap into the real power that is within us. So, moving right along, if you look at the trauma research over 40 years, Bessel van der Kolk and Bruce Perry and so on are basically saying that, look, trauma is held in our bodies. Bessel talks about our bodies feeling booby-trapped when we have trauma. We can't talk our way out of trauma. And so what do you need to do? Our issues are squarely in our tissues. And so they're pointing at movement. We have to move. Using our bodies not just for body awareness, but for actual kinesthetic movement. And just taking the neuroscience research and the trauma research, you get to a more powerful solution. Wow, mindfulness, 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 movement, movement, movement. You get mindful movement. You also start to realize that if your mindfulness practice is essentially static or sedentary, by definition, it is not trauma-informed. Let's be very clear. Talking about trauma, knowing about trauma doesn't make anything trauma-informed. Doesn't make the practice trauma-informed. Yes, we'll get to SEL in a bit. So when neuroscience meets trauma research, something very exciting happens. And I'm pointing you at some research that was done very recently. If you don't know about it, you may want to look it up. Professor Adele Diamond, a developmental cognitive neuroscientist at University of British Columbia in Vancouver, has conducted a 3-year massive meta-study, 179 studies, 193 papers from around the world, looking at ways to develop what she calls executive functions. Executive functions are higher order thinking capabilities that are extremely important for our health, for our well-being, for the choices we make, for the way we act, and so on and so forth. And what she found, out of all of the ways that she looked at, cognitive training, computerized, non-computerized, neurofeedback, she looked at sedentary mindfulness, movement-based mindfulness, she looked at theater, sports, you name it. She found that mindful movement by far is the best to develop executive functions in every single category of comparison. She was blown away because she wasn't even expecting this result. And she knows us well, she knows our work. She's been trained by us. She was updating me on the results of the research along these last 3-4 years. And basically this points, why is this so interesting? Because it points to a convergence that I just mentioned before. Executive functions build empathy, self-awareness, self-regulation, all the emotional intelligence that we need, reasoning, cognitive flexibility to take on others' viewpoints. And basically, this beautiful convergence showing up in some of the latest research in neuroscience, saying, yes, the trauma research and the neuroscience research are now converging right in front of our eyes. How can we afford to miss it. Yes, for Maria, look up diamond and ling, diamond as in the jewel, and ling, L-I-N-G. And you can go onto the DevCog Neuro Lab at UBC and you'll find it. It's about a 500-page paper, about a 30-page abstract. Very beautiful, powerful, comprehensive study. As you mull over the insights that we gain from this study, perhaps, let's take another mindful moment. We've been sitting for a bit. If you're comfortable, come up standing. Otherwise, we can try it sitting as well. Gloria is one of our students, longtime students. A few others are showing up, familiar faces. Perhaps you can watch them if you like. Let me just describe a very simple movement. Feet a little bit apart. Yeah, look at Sheila demonstrating. Beautiful. Feet are a little bit apart. Arms are relaxed by your side or resting at your hips. And you're just starting to twist at the hips. A spinal twist, just like the kids in the school are showing. And you're going out to one side and you're going out to the other. And before long, you fold in the rhythm of the breath. A quick puff of air out at each end. And then you start to move with as much speed and power and momentum as you're comfortable. A quick exhale at each end. Inhale takes care of itself as you transition through the center without stopping. Arms by your side, just coming out as far as you're comfortable. You're leading with the hips, and then you're following through with your shoulders, your head and neck, and perhaps tracking the movement with your eyes. A few rounds at your own pace, and then gradually coming back to neutral, settling back into your chairs. Once more, our friend the chime, listening with your fullest possible attention for the very last trace of sound. Yes, some of you are picking up, the integration of some of these practices, absolutely. All right, so someone mentioned SEL, and so I remember being invited to Castle's headquarters several years ago with about 20 other people who are all either experts in mindfulness or experts in SEL into a conversation saying, okay, what is the connection between SEL and mindfulness? And I was basically cracking up saying, look, it's not one or the other. There's a very simple mapping here, okay? And this is the mapping of our dynamic or trauma-informed mindfulness wheel. And I just set it up against the Castle wheel. If you're familiar with the 5 core competencies of social emotional learning, you see a mapping. Self-awareness shows up in both. Self-regulation, that we call emotion regulation, is basically responsible decision-making and self-management. Those are basically the emotion regulation piece. And then you have, social awareness and relationship skills, which we map into healthy relationships. And yet there are 2 key differences in this whole framework of the whole child. And of course, SEL is not just about just the students. It has to be the entire ecosystem of educational systems, right? Where there's students, there's staff, there's teachers, counselors, etc., administrators, and then there's families. So thinking about that whole ecosystem, basically stress resilience is blatantly missing in the Castle framework. And knowing what we know about what stress and trauma do to our brains, we can't afford not to start there. Attention control, emotion regulation, healthy coping, empathy, all of these are impacted by chronic stress. And so we start with a bit of stress resilience. As you do that, you're overwhelmed less often, optimal more often. Once you have some semblance of stress resilience, then you get to self-awareness. What is the essence of self-awareness? Where I'm mad, I'm sad, shifting to I feel mad, I feel sad. That's a powerful shift. Dan Siegel was there at a conference when I was presenting. He said, that's so elegant. Now you'll see that his institute, Mindsight, says that, yes, this is the very definition of self-awareness. A little distance between a powerful emotion that we're not sweeping under the rug by any means, but putting it in place, a little distance between that and the witness of the emotion, knowing that the emotion is transient, that the emotion isn't all of me. Then you have emotion regulation. And that capacity, in essence, is the ability to act versus merely react. To be able to consciously, deliberately choose my response. It's about locus of control. It's about self-efficacy. And once you have that, these intrapersonal skills, the first three, are basically all inside of us. But it doesn't just stop there. Then you get to healthy relationships, the social dimension of the practice, instead of me, mine, the we. Instead of us and them, the othering that's been pointed out earlier. It's us. Essence of empathy, of course, as we well know, is interconnectedness and interdependence. That starts to show up with the power and the potential of trauma-informed mindfulness practice. And so as you go around this wheel, around and around and around, incrementally building one skill on top of another, you are propelling yourself towards self-mastery. And as you shared this with others, you allow for that same ripple effect to happen. So you may ask, what is the research that justifies all of this? There's quite a bit of research around generic mindfulness, but here are independent researchers from the Penn State Prevention Research Center, from UC Berkeley and other places who have been looking at dynamic mindfulness, trauma-informed mindfulness, our specific approach of movement-based mindfulness, and just look at some of these results. Statistically significant with large effect sizes, non-trivial in this area of work. Whether it's anxiety, depression, global psychological distress, rumination, intrusive thoughts, physical and emotional arousal, reduced hostility, revenge motivation, all of these come tumbling out. Map these to implications for the perpetrators of white supremacy and systemic racism. Significant increases in emotional regulation, positive thinking, cognitive restructuring, self-control, school engagement. We have also conducted case studies in many of our schools. At any one time, we're probably in 100 schools serving close to 100,000 students. What are we finding? We actually looked at it in three different perspectives. One is, what are students saying this practice is doing to them? And so the bar graphs are basically primary ed versus secondary ed. Then we asked teachers, what are the changes you're seeing in your students? A teacher's perspective on the students. And the third perspective was, what is it doing for you? And so look at some of this. Look at the questions, look at the percentages. These are non-trivial. And this was 2018. Another 1,500 students in 2019, and then another 180 or so teachers. So we're looking at between 18 and 19, very similar data. And we're looking at probably 3,500, 4,000 students in our inner cities and about 350 educators. Just look at this. Students better at managing their emotions, better at focus and concentration, more self-control, making healthier choices. What is the power of that? Relationships with each other, with adults around them, trying a little bit harder at work, the motivation piece. And then look at this, 18, 19, 95% of the teachers are saying we have a better classroom climate. And this is just a few minutes a day of movement-based mindfulness. And then what is it doing to the teachers? Because we don't just want to be in every school forever. We want to build school capacity. We want teachers to be able to utilize these skills because, of course, not only that they get to share it with their students, but more importantly, with compassion fatigue and burnout, it's real, this national shortage of quality educators. And they're on the front lines of imbibing stress and trauma vicariously. And so they need help. Look at the data. And again, look at the percentages. Better at managing my emotions, more self-aware, better relationships. And then look at the last two, taking more time for my own well-being and sustaining myself better as an educator. How many of you can say that that is true for yourself? Imagine if most of our educators were able to say those two things, a resounding yes, what it would do to teacher burnout. Taking in some of the implications of these results. You've heard the scientific background, the neuroscience and the trauma research converging with the executive function work. Now you saw some data around the impact of dynamic mindfulness in real schools, often in schools that are in underserved communities, Title I schools, high percentage of students, free and reduced price lunches, often many students of color, often at high risk of school failure, juvenile delinquency. That's the kind of place we've often been in. Paraphrasing Steve Jobs, it's like mindfulness for the rest of us, that kind of an idea. And so let's take one more mindful moment. So you're sitting comfortably. Again, if you like, you could do this standing. It's a little subtle movement. As you're breathing in, you're gently curling your fingers into giant, strong fists. And as you're breathing out, gently opening up your hands into receptive palms. You're breathing in, slowly clenching your fists, nice and tight and hard. And as you're breathing out, gently opening up and letting go. Feel free to add a bit of rhythm to your breathing now, where you're slowing down your exhale. Letting go is hard. Give it a bit more time. Breathing in to a count of 3 or 4, and breathing out twice as slowly to 6 or 8, at your own pace. Perhaps adding a little hint of meaning to this deceptively simple mindful movement. When you're curling your hands into fists, what are you clinging to? What is hard to let go? The biases, the prejudices, the likes, the dislikes. What is it? Not just stuff. What ideas, what thoughts, what baggage? And then when you're opening up your hands, what are you letting go? What judgment? What preconception? It's taking a moment to add your own meaning to this mindful movement. Three M's: mindfulness, movement, meaning. Transforming the practice into relevance in life, personal and professional. And now the chime. Listening with your fullest possible attention for the very last trace of this fading, evanescent sound. Thank you. You know, I was conducting a training, dynamic mindfulness training for a bunch of folks from around the country and beyond, just 2 days ago. And right in the middle of that training, there's an interesting share out. A Latino man, participant, piped out. And I'm sorry I had to stop my video for a bit. I had the audio on, I was listening to you, but I had to shut it off because I was dealing with a family emergency. I said, yes, share as much as you would like. What was going on? She said, you know, I have a 12-year-old daughter. She was just coming home, walking home. And there's a man right behind her and screaming at her and saying horrible things to her. I saw that she was completely agitated, overwhelmed. And you know, I'm an Aikido practitioner. My normal impulse would be to reach for my Aikido practice sword and basically take care of business. And yet what I did was, I just sat by my daughter and I taught her to do the breathing techniques that you were just teaching us. It helped her. It helped me. This amazing, palpable, powerful impact that happened in moments. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a little story. This was just one example of how these practices could play out, right? I don't know whether it was white supremacy, but there was some form of othering that was happening right in front of our eyes, right in the midst of the training and the moment. And the power of the practice showed. You see, when we go about trying to say how my mindfulness is better than your mindfulness, we need to get over that nonsense. 5,000 years of practice, who the heck are we to try to, claim it's all ours, newfangled inventions, my foot. That kind of an idea, a little bit of awareness that we're standing on the shoulders of giants who have developed this practice over thousands and thousands of years, makes us a little bit more humble, a little bit more accepting of the variations in these practices, not too rushing to call it all ours. It's just pure hubris. And so with that, a little tool that we have that's widely used in our schools, giving you a sense of the power and the possibility to essentially go from learning the practice to doing the practice to actually living the practice. None of us seem to much have the luxury of hours of meditation these days. And yet, can we distill it down to a few minutes a day? The research around our work has been three sessions, 15 minutes a week. So that boils down to about 45 minutes a week. You break it down in 7 days, it's like 6 minutes a day, about the time it takes to brush our teeth, right? And the idea is it doesn't even have to be 6 contiguous minutes. It could be 1 6-minute practice, 2 3-minute practices, 3 2-minute practices. And so this little mood shifter used to be a big giant poster, color-coded and all that, 2 feet by 3 feet, and schools just loved it. They would order them by the zillions and say, every classroom, every common area, every office, that kind of thing. And what was it? It's such a simple design. We basically said, okay, this is nudging a little bit of self-awareness, even in the choice and the application of this little tool. So how do I want to feel? Not so much what do I do when I'm mad, when I'm sad. It's very strengths-based in its design. I want to feel more calm. I want to feel more relaxed. I want to feel more focused. I'm feeling tired. I want to feel more energized. So anxious to calm, distracted to focused, stressed to relax. It's all just right there. Each of these little items in the matrix is like a 2-minute practice of movement-based mindfulness. And so a way to think about integrating mindful movement practices throughout our day. First thing in the morning, just before going to bed, transitions, etc., etc. Just moments of practice. And if we're able to do that, each of us, and then those we serve, then it opens up the possibility, just like Mother Teresa in all humility saying, what power do I have to change the world? In the same way, if each of us becomes a little pebble of practice, who knows where the ripples will end up, where we can dream about the possibility of a mindful generation, millions of mindful children and the adults around them, and the implications for countering racism, the systems that perpetuate racism, the sense of supremacy, difference, domination over others, at the very root of the problem, so we can be the change that we wish to see in the world. Thank you all. Yes. So, thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, thank you for sharing the Rumi poem, Igor. Yes, big fan of Rumi, big fan of Hafiz. Yes. What thoughts?
I wanted to thank you so much for that. I didn't know what to anticipate. When coming into this, we've been working on becoming more aware of social justice, et cetera, in my school. And I know about mindfulness, and it helps so much to connect my mindful practice to that goal. And I'll be bringing this back to my school and to the faculty at my school who's been working on this for the whole school year. And the implementation now is our next phase. So I really feel like this has given us a wonderful outline for that. So I really, really appreciate that.
Beautiful, beautiful. So some questions came up, how do I get the poster, etc. So I'm just sending out a message to all of you. You can go onto our website, niroga.org. You will see some of our programs, some of our research that I mentioned. You'll see some of those papers right there. You will also have a way to communicate with us directly. Transform at Niroga will get to our office. And depending on what support you need, that's exactly what we're looking for, is what support do you need to create a more mindful school, to create a more mindful home, to create a more mindful community, to create a more mindful workspace? How can we help? We're a little nonprofit. We're there to try to serve as selflessly, as unconditionally as possible. We've been doing this for 16 years. And so reach out what you need to make your work more effective, because we are in this together, you know. The world needs this work probably more urgently than ever. And so I'm just grateful for all of you to come in, to be engaged, to learn together, to grow together. Let's go change the world. What else to dream about? Yes.
Hi, Dr. Bose. I have a question.
I'll go next. I'll go next.
Before you start, we have about 5 minutes and the cameras shut off kind of automatically. So just a 5-minute warning.
Okay, great. Thank you. My name is Chatin. I work in New York City. I work in public schools and also in detention centers with youth. And my struggle with teaching mindfulness in these places that are inherently systems of oppression is like teaching young people how to self-regulate and empower themselves and tap into their inner resilience, but yet they're in systems that oppress them. So that's kind of my struggle in doing this work. Like, how do we widen the container, not just teaching our students, but actually changing the systems from the inside out?
Yes, yes. And so probably the first thing to be clear about this, you know, I speak my mind, I'm not scared of anyone. And so I will say this bluntly, as I've said before, the mindfulness community is often largely responsible to make this practice socially elite and culturally incongruent. That's not okay. That's worse than useless. Useless may be okay under some circumstances, but worse than useless is not okay. And so we need to understand that. A universal practice that anyone can do anytime, anywhere. And how is it that it's becoming socially elite, where white people do it, rich people do it, et cetera, et cetera? What is going on here? Incredibly expensive programs around mindfulness. What are we doing? And so why isn't there going to be a bunch of skepticism when it comes to the dissemination of these practices? Not only that, I also hear this idea that, oh, if we're all calm, if we're all relaxed, that's almost like we're giving ourselves a frontal lobotomy, anesthetizing ourselves to actually keep that edge of the struggle.
Yes.
And I take that quite seriously. I nudge you to look at the mechanisms that justify this practice that's been around for 5,000 years. The neuroscience is saying that when you train your brain to be mindful, it is in a beautiful, powerful state of relaxed awareness, relaxed alertness. You're not so relaxed that you're vegged out, you're dulled. You're not so alert that you're hyper alert, like a cop killing unnecessarily, because it does become a matter of life and death. The idea that if you are at the peak of your creativity, if you have, you know, as much intuition as possible, these are the results of real mindfulness practice, then you are going to be at your creative best in terms of how to keep up with this struggle and fight it as seriously as possible. This is not about dulling any ability to fight. It's that you are going to be better able to engage in the struggle with sustainability in mind for the long term. And that is how I think of it myself, and I see it in our work in the field. Does that make sense? So two challenges for us. One is looking at how we ourselves are making this socially elite and culturally incongruent, checking for that. Who is practicing mindfulness? Who is sharing mindfulness? How is it peddled, et cetera, et cetera? Because there's big money to be made in this, it seems, these days. The second is, what is the purpose? Why are we doing it? How can we relate it to the kinds of things that I was trying to address in this talk, in this presentation? Why isn't more of this not happening in the mindfulness education world? We're talking about calm classrooms. Is that all? When our societies are exploding in chaos, we're talking about some magical sense of calmness for a few moments? Calm and relaxed, vegged out. We need to understand how much more powerful mindfulness is if we are really able to embody it, not just learn mindfulness, not just talk about mindfulness, not even just do a bit of mindfulness, but to actually live mindfully. That becomes a test for all of us before we rush to teach mindfulness.
I would like to just say something before we finish up.
Yes.
I wanted to, and it kind of works into what you just said. I'm feeling as if those little mindfulness breaks that you showed us are an integral part of how we bring mindfulness into our life. Because and for the lady who was talking about how to bring it into the schools, for me as a teacher, it feels like simply taking a break from a lesson, during a lesson or during something, and
Yes.
having the children just feel their bodies for that little moment. And little by little, I feel as if these little mindfulness breaks are incremental, and they grow, right? It's like you're planting the seed, and then they grow and they grow. And eventually you can then say, now let's put all this together, and this is what mindfulness means. But to just be giving one little
Yes.
seed at a time, that's what I really loved about how you interspersed that in your own lesson to us.
Yes. Yeah, beautiful.
So thank
what
you for that.
Of course, what you just said brought up two quick things for me. One is, Bessel van der Kolk has this book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? Talking about how trauma is ingrained in our bodies and so on. But in the same way, mindfulness also helps the body keep the score. And so as you do bits more mindfulness, you are gently, dissolving away some of the trauma that we hold in our bodies, and it has a powerful integrative process. The second is that we often say, oh, we're so busy, right? The most stretched out people in the world, they don't seem to have time for stress management, right? And that's just the nature of it. Oh, I'm so terribly busy. God forbid we'd not be so busy, we'd have nothing to do. But in any case, the point is that my challenge to all of you is, you can't find time for mindfulness? Tell me when you are not being mindful and why. I'm walking. What prevents me from walking mindfully? I'm talking. What prevents me from talking mindfully? From eating mindfully. From washing the dishes, from folding the laundry, from chopping onions in the kitchen, whatever we're doing. The challenge is, when am I not mindful and why? Because that's when you start to move from doing mindfulness, which is a good thing, to actually something way more powerful and way more transformative. When I'm living mindfully, every moment, every step, every breath, every second is got a gentle layering of mindfulness. And that is when magic starts to really happen. You know what? A school principal once said, 1,000 a big man built like a football player. And, he was trying to nudge the practice into himself, because when he wanted to bring this into his school, I'd given him these few practices in one sheet of paper. And I said, hey, if you're serious, you need to practice this. And so several months later, he was recounting how he's able to fold this practice into everything he's doing, walking the dog, playing with the kids, driving to work, etc. And then he started to tear up, this big, powerful man, and says, BK, it's getting to the point when this practice won't let me go. I mean, just see how beautiful it is, right? Is your mindfulness like that? Even as you're selling it, you're sharing it and so on, that this practice won't let you go? I learned this practice when I was 4 or 5 years old from my father, and then, of course, from other wonderful masters. It's part of my DNA. That is my constant personal challenge. When am I not mindful? And why? So we say, learn, live, give. In that specific order. I think we're getting to the end of our time. I want to thank you all once again. Take good care, and take care of yourselves. Take care of those around you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
So